I set the book on the table in front of 400 people, and I understood, with total clarity, that I had just handed them everything they needed to finish me. 17 entries, 17 dates, 17 times a scribe had corrected her own Alpha King in public, written down in her own hand. Signed because I am incapable of doing anything else, and because there was no version of saving him that did not require me to convict myself first. The man who had built this whole trap was already smiling. He thought I had lost my nerve, and brought him a confession. I had brought him a confession. That was the point. It simply was not mine. Read the dates, my lord, I said, out loud, all 17, and then tell this hall who wrote the documents. 9 weeks earlier, I had opened my mouth in that same hall over a single word, and every person in it had stopped breathing at once. My name is Aleph, and I am a scribe, which means I am the least important person in any room I have ever been in, and the only one who can prove what happened in it. I was 27 that spring. No house, no rank, third daughter of a chandler who could not afford a fourth, and I had a hand. That is the whole of my story. Until this one, I had a good hand and a better ear, and by 20 I was copying charters in the Felguard record room for a wage that would embarrass you. And by 27, I ran it. In every way, except the way that comes with a title or a salary. I loved it. I want that understood, because people assume the correction was courage, and it was not. It was a reflex. I have spent my life among documents that have to be right, because a charter is the only thing standing between a family and a man with a better lawyer. And if the words are wrong, then somebody in 40 years loses their land over my carelessness. Accuracy is not a virtue in my trade, it is the entire trade. Which is why, on the 9th of that month, at the opening of the spring court, standing at the recorder's desk with my pen already moving, I heard the King of Felguard say the founding oath wrong, and I corrected him. I need you to picture the room. 400 people, every ranked house in the territory. King Hadrian of Felguard on his feet at the head of it. 11 years on that throne. A man who had ended 2 border wars and was widely held to be the most dangerous thing north of the river. Reciting the oath, his line had recited, for 200 years. I am the king. I am the hand of the law. The king rules the Felguard, and the Felguard endures. Except, he did not say rules. He said, the king serves the Felguard. And I said, out loud, in my ordinary working voice, without looking up from my page, it's rules, Your Grace. I want to tell you what happened next. But nothing happened next. That is the point. 400 people stopped breathing at the same time, and the hall went so quiet, I could hear the pen in my own hand. I have thought about that silence a great deal since. It was not shock at my rudeness, or it was. But that was the shallow part. The deep part was that in 11 years, in that hall, nobody had ever found out what happened after. There was no established procedure. A scribe had told the Alpha King he was wrong in front of his entire court. And 400 people simply waited to learn what that was like, because none of them knew. I put my pen down. I remember that. I put my pen down because my hands had gone stupid. And I did not want to blot the page. King Hadrian turned and looked at me for what I have since been told was 4 seconds, and what I experienced as roughly a season. And then his mouth twitched. That is all. One corner, a single badly suppressed movement at the left side of a king's mouth, gone almost before it arrived, and 400 people saw it, and the Felguard court has not recovered. And neither, if I am honest with you, have I. Rules, he said. Thank you, mistress. And he said the oath again, correctly, in full, from the beginning, in front of everyone. Then he carried on with the session as though a scribe correcting the crown were an ordinary Tuesday, and the hall took roughly 15 minutes to remember how to conduct business. And I sat at my desk with my ears ringing and wrote it all down, because that is my job. I fully expected to be dismissed by supper. I was not dismissed by supper. I was not dismissed at all. What happened instead was, in its own way, considerably worse. 3 days later, at the reading of the water rights, King Hadrian said appurtenance, when the text said appurtenances, and paused and looked directly at me. The entire council looked at me. I have never wanted anything less in my life. But the text said appurtenances, and there were 11 households downstream whose claim would turn on that word in some future dispute, and I am what I am. Appurtenances, Your Grace. Appurtenances, that twitch again. Thank you, Mistress Aelith. He had learned my name. Somewhere between Tuesday and Friday, the Alpha King of Felgard had gone and learned the name of his record room's scribe, and he used it in front of his council. Twice. The third time was the following week. The fourth was the week after that. By the 6th, the entire keep had a theory, and the theory was that the King of Felgard had begun making mistakes on purpose. I want to be clear that this was not a subtle man. Whatever Hadrian was doing, he was doing it with the grace and delicacy of a siege engine. He would arrive at a reading, deliver 40 minutes of flawless statute, in a voice that could stop a border raid, and then produce one enormous grammatical wound in the middle of a subordinate clause, and sit there radiating what I can only describe as anticipation. The council was in a state. Lord Roderick, his second, took to standing behind the throne with the expression of a man watching his commander walk into a lake. He's the most precise man I have ever served, Roderick told me, in a corridor in the 5th week, with the desperation of someone who needs another adult in the room. 11 years. 11 years of that man reciting 8-page treaties from memory without a scrap of parchment. I have watched him correct ambassadors. He looked at me almost pleadingly. Mistress Aelith, what have you done to him? I've done nothing. I corrected a word. You corrected a word, Roderick agreed grimly. And now the King of Felgard cannot conjugate. I laughed. I should not have. It was the first time I had laughed since the 9th, and I did it in a corridor with the King's second, about the King. And I have thought since that this was the exact moment the thing became inevitable. The keep, meanwhile, had gone completely feral about it. The kitchen staff had a tally. I learned this from a potboy who assumed I already knew, and who was extremely eager to tell me that the standing wager was on whether the King would clear 20 before the summer session, and that the odds had shortened dramatically after Demesne. The stable hands had a rival tally that counted only errors made while looking directly at me, which they held to be the only honest measure, and which they were correct about, though I did not tell them so. Somebody, I never found out who, and I have not tried very hard, began leaving a grammar primer on the recorder's desk before each session. A child's one, with illustrations. It was gone by the 3rd week, which I assume means Roderick found it before the King did, and I have never asked that man to confirm it, because there are things one does not need to know, and the errors got worse. That is the part that ought to have told me. They got bigger and stranger, and less like anything a mouth would produce, and I sat at my desk with my pen and corrected each one, and felt every single time the specific vertigo of a woman who cannot decide whether she is being courted or made a fool of. Because I did not know. That is what I need you to understand about those weeks. I had no idea what was happening to me. A scribe does not get looked at. That is not modesty. It is the job description. You sit at the low desk and you become furniture. And by 27, I was extremely good furniture and had arranged my entire interior life around it. There was no version of me that had a story where a king learned my name. So I did what I have always done with things I cannot verify. I refused to conclude. I told myself he was bored. I told myself it was a game a powerful man plays with a person who cannot refuse to play. I told myself at 3 in the morning that a man who ends border wars does not develop an 11-week interest in a chandler's third daughter, and that women who believe otherwise end up in the sort of ballads that do not have happy endings. And then he would say, "A pertinent," and look at me, and every single one of those arguments would go straight out of my head. He spoke to me once, properly, in that stretch. Only once. He came down to the record room at an hour when nobody comes to the record room, and stood in the doorway. That man could not enter a room to save his life. I have decided it is a genuine affliction, and asked me what I was working on. It was a boundary schedule, the dullest document in Felgard. 40 pages of hedges. I told him so, and he said, "Show me." And I looked at him for a moment, and then I did, because he had asked, and because nobody had ever asked. We were there 2 hours. I explained hedges to the Alpha King of the Northern Territories for 2 hours, and he asked 11 questions, and every single one of them was a good question. And at the end of it he said, "Who else knows this?" "Nobody, Your Grace. It's a hedge schedule. Somebody's grandson will lose a farm over it in 60 years. "Yes," I said, "that's exactly it. That's the whole," and I stopped, because I had been about to say that's the whole reason I do this, to a king, out loud, and because he was looking at me with an expression that I had absolutely no filing system for. He left shortly after. He did not close the distance between us, not once, in 2 hours over 40 pages of hedges. I noticed the not closing more than I have ever noticed anything a man actually did. Because here is what I believed in those weeks. I believed a very powerful and very awkward man had worked out that the only reliable way to make a scribe with no house and no rank speak to him in public was to be wrong in front of her, and had committed to that strategy with his entire chest and no plan whatsoever for how it ended. I believed it was courtship. Clumsy, catastrophic, executed like a military campaign by a man who had clearly never once in his life had to persuade anybody of anything. And I was charmed. God help me, I was so charmed. Lord Crail, the Chancellor, was the only man at that table who seemed to find none of it funny. He was master of the rolls, the man who prepared every document that crossed the king's hands, who had done it for 19 years, and who ran the record room's output the way a general runs a supply line. He was my superior. He had also, I want to say plainly, been perfectly decent to me for 7 years. "You must stop," he said in the 8th week, in his office gently. "I say this as someone who has protected your position more than once. The court is beginning to talk about him, Aelith. Not about you, about him. A king who is corrected weekly by a scribe is a king who is corrected weekly. And there are men in this territory who have wanted an excuse for 11 years. He steepled his fingers. "You think you're being accurate. From where the council sits, you are dismantling him, one word at a time. Then he should stop making errors." "Yes," Lord Crail said. "He should. Have you asked yourself why he doesn't?" I did not know yet what I was actually looking at. I did not know that the answer to that question was sitting in the man asking it. If you want to find out what it costs a king to let a scribe humiliate him in his own hall week after week, and whether a woman whose entire identity is accuracy can survive discovering she has been wrong about the single most important thing in her life, stay with me. What I found in my own correction log took the whole of that court apart, and I lived every second of it. The dinner was the 9th week, and it was not a dinner, it was an ambush disguised as one, and I mean that affectionately. Hadrian invited the record room, all of us, 11 scribes and a chancellor, at a long table in a side hall, ostensibly to thank the department for the spring session, which no king of Felgard had ever once done in the history of the department. He sat me at his left hand. Of course he did. Subtlety, as I have said. I have prepared some remarks, he told me. Your Grace, it's a dinner. I have prepared some remarks, he repeated, with the fixed determination of a man who has written something down and intends to deliver it regardless of terrain. And then he delivered 4 minutes of formal, immaculate, catastrophically ill-judged praise of the Felgard Record Room's contribution to the stability of the Northern Territories, to a table of scribes who wanted their soup. It was the worst speech I have ever heard. I have kept a copy. He wrote it out himself, which I know because I recognized the hand, and because it had been revised 11 times. That was terrible, I told him, quietly, when he sat down. It was, he agreed, with feeling. I know. I could hear it happening and I could not stop. He turned his cup a quarter turn on the table and did not look at me. I am extremely good at approximately 4 things, Mistress Aelith, and every one of them involves a border. I have no idea how to do this. I have been trying for 9 weeks, and I am aware that I am doing it badly, and I would very much like you to tell me what the correct form is, because you are the only person in this kingdom who tells me when I have the form wrong. I did not have an answer. I looked at my soup with my whole face burning. You could simply talk to me, I said eventually. You didn't have to break the statutes. He went still. It was very slight. If I had not spent 9 weeks watching that man's face for a twitch, I would have missed it entirely. Yes, he said. About that. And then Lord Crail said something from the other end of the table. And the moment closed. And it took me 2 more weeks and my own handwriting to find out what he had been about to tell me. I found it in my correction log. Every scribe keeps one. It is not optional, and it is not romantic. When you correct an official text, you record the date, the document, the erroneous form, and the true one, so that when somebody's grandson sues in 40 years, there is a record of what was fixed and by whom. I had 17 entries. I was reading back through them for an unrelated reason, the way you do, and my own handwriting told me something that stopped my heart. The errors had changed kind. The first one, serves for rules, was an error of the ear. That is a specific thing, and I know it the way a smith knows metal. It is the mistake of a man who learned a phrase by hearing it. The wrong word, but a word that sounds like a thing a person would say, that fits the mouth, that carries the same rhythm. Men who recite from memory make errors of the ear. It is the most human mistake there is. Every error, after the third, was an error of the eye. Appurtenant for appurtenances. Demise for domain. Words that look alike on a page and sound nothing alike at all. Words no man misspeaks. Words a man only gets wrong if he is reading them, or if somebody hands him a page with the wrong word already on it. Hadrian did not read from pages. He recited 11 years. Roderick had told me so himself, in a corridor, half in despair, and I had not heard it. Something in me went very still and very clear. The king had not been making errors to talk to me. The king had made exactly 1 error, in the 9th week of spring, honestly, out of his own mouth, and every single one after that had been given to him. Somebody had been altering the king's texts for 9 weeks, and every week In front of his entire court, the most accurate scribe in Felgard had stood up and corrected him for it, publicly, in her ordinary working voice, 17 times, and written each one down in her own hand in a log that Lord Crail, as Master of the Rolls, reviewed monthly. I had not been charmed by a king's clumsy courtship. I had been the instrument. I was the thing that made it count. Anyone can snip a wrong word into a document. It takes a scribe with a reputation for never being wrong to stand up in open court and make it a matter of record. I went to Hadrian that night. I did not knock. "How long have you known?" He was at his desk. He looked up at me, and I watched him decide not to lie. And I have never in my life been so angry at a man for a kindness. "Since the 3rd, he said. "The 3rd. I could hardly get it out. You've known since the 3rd, and you let me stand up in front of your entire court 14 more times and take you apart with my own mouth." Yes. Why? And Hadrian of Felgard, who had ended 2 border wars, said the stupidest, most infuriating, most unforgivable thing I have ever heard. Because the alternative was telling you to stop checking. I stood there with my mouth open. I could have had the texts guarded, he said. I could have set a trap and caught him in a month and looked competent the whole time. And every single one of those plans required me to walk into that record room and say to you, "Mistress Eilith, when you see an error in my documents, let it pass." He stood up. "I have 11 councillors, 400 courtiers, and a kingdom, and there is exactly one person in the whole of it who tells me when I am wrong. 1. I have been king for 11 years, and I did not know what that was worth until a scribe with no house said, 'It's rules, Your Grace,' in front of 400 people who were all too frightened to. His voice did something. I was not going to be the man who taught you to let it pass. I would rather my own court think me a fool. I would rather it for years, Eilith. It is not close. They're going to unseat you. Probably for grammar. For 17 documented instances of the Crown misstating its own statutes entered in the official record by the Crown's own scribe, which under Felgard law is more than sufficient to open a competency review and appoint a protector. He said it quite calmly. Crail files it in the morning. I've known that for a week too. Crail filed it in the morning. He did it beautifully. That is the thing I want you to understand about that man. There was no forgery in it, no lie, nothing a court could strike. Every document he submitted was true. 17 errors in the record, corrected by the Crown's own scribe on 17 dates. In my hand. He had spent 9 weeks building an entirely honest case out of an entirely dishonest thing. And the only 2 people alive who could see the difference were the king he was unseating and the woman who had unknowingly written it. He moved for a protector. Himself, of course, in all but the naming. And the council, those 11 men who had watched their king fumble a subordinate clause every week for 2 months, were going to give it to him. I could see it on them. They were not villains. They had simply watched with their own eyes, week after week, and drawn the obvious conclusion. Which brings us back to the hall. I set the book on the table in front of 400 people, and I understood with total clarity that I had just handed them everything they needed to finish me. 17 entries, 17 dates. 17 times a scribe had corrected her own Alpha King in public, written down in her own hand, signed, because a scribe who publicly contradicts the Crown 17 times has, under the same law Crail was using, committed 17 counts of contempt of the seat. And the penalty for that is not gentle, and I had signed every one of them myself. There was no version of saving him that did not start with me convicting myself. My log was the only document in Felgard that could do it, and my log was the confession. Lord Crail was already smiling. He thought I had lost my nerve and brought him a confession. "Read the dates, my lord," I said, out loud, all 17, "and then tell this hall who wrote the documents." He read them. He had to. 400 people were watching, and a man who has spent 19 years being reasonable cannot suddenly refuse to read. "Now the errors," I said, "just the errors. In order: serves, appurtenant, demise, Enphioff, distrain, stop." I turned to the hall. "Every one of you just heard it, and not one of you knows what you heard, so I am going to tell you, because it is my trade, and it is the only thing I have. The first error is an error of the ear. Serves for rules, a word that sounds like something a man would say, that fits the mouth, that a man makes when he is reciting from memory. That one was his. That one was honest. And I corrected it, and he thanked me in front of you all, and said it again properly, and that is the last honest mistake anybody in this hall has heard. The other 16 are errors of the eye. Demise for domains, appurtenant for appurtenances. My lords, say those out loud. Try. They sound nothing alike. No man alive misspeaks demesne as demise. It is not possible. It is not a thing a mouth does. I let that sit. It is a thing a page does. Those are the errors of a man reading a document that already has the wrong word on it. The hall had gone very quiet. I have grown familiar with that particular silence. Your king does not read from pages, I said. He recites. Every one of you has watched him do it for 11 years. Lord Roderick has watched him do it to ambassadors. So there is precisely one way King Hadrian of Felgard produced 16 scribal errors out of his own mouth in 9 weeks, and that is that somebody put them in his hands first. I turned around. "Who prepares the king's texts, my Lord Chancellor?" Lord Crail did not answer. He did not have to. 19 years of preparing every document that crossed that throne answered for him, out of 400 throats at once. He went for the log. Of course he did. It was the only object in the room that mattered, and he understood that before anyone else. Roderick got there first. And Roderick is not a young man, and I have never seen anything move like that. They stripped Crail of the chancellorship inside the hour, and everything else inside the season. He never once confessed. He said, right to the end, that he had submitted nothing but true documents, and that a council which could not tell the difference between an error of the ear and an error of the eye had no business governing anything, which is, I am obliged to admit, the single most accurate thing that man ever said. And then the council, having disposed of him, turned to the other matter, which was me. 17 counts. In my own hand. Signed. I want to tell you that the king saved me. He did not, and I am glad, because he could not have without breaking the exact thing he had spent 9 weeks refusing to break. Roderick saved me, with the most magnificent piece of pedantry I have ever heard in my life. He stood up, that grim old soldier, and observed that the statute defines contempt of the seat as contradiction of the crown, and that a contradiction requires the crown to have been stated, and that on all 17 occasions the crown had not been stated at all, since the words the king spoke were, by the hall's own finding, not his. She never contradicted the king, Roderick said. There was nothing of the king in those pages to contradict. She contradicted Lord Crail 17 times, in public, and she was right on every count, and I'd have her do it again. They argued about it for 2 days. 2 days. I sat in a room and waited to find out whether my whole life was over on a point of grammar, which is, when I think about it, the most fitting possible end I could have been offered. They acquitted me on the technicality. My own trade saved me. I have never been so grateful to a subordinate clause. Hadrian came to the record room that evening. Not the hall, not the study, my room, with the ink and the crates, which no king of Felgard had ever entered. "I'm told you were nearly finished on a preposition," he said. "A dependent clause, your grace. Get it right." He laughed, the real one, the one that had been trying to get out of that man's face since the 9th of spring. And then he stopped, and he was serious, and he did the thing he had been failing to do for 11 weeks. "I've no idea how to do this," he said. "I have established that comprehensively and in public. So I'm going to do it badly, one final time, and then I am going to stop and let you tell me the correct form. You said it's rules, your grace, in front of 400 people when every other soul in that hall had spent 11 years letting me walk around wrong. You didn't do it to be brave. That's why it undid me. You did it because a word was wrong, and you cannot leave a wrong word alone. And I have wanted, every day since, to be a man who is looked at like that, like something that has to be right, and is worth the trouble of correcting." His hands were not quite steady. "Stay, not as my scribe. The record room is yours, and I'll not make that a gift. It's a wage, and you've earned it twice. Stay, because I have been king 11 years, and you are the only person who has ever bothered to fix me." That was a very bad speech. "I know," he said. "Tell me the correct form." I kissed him first, in the record room, with ink on my hands. It was brief, and it was warm, and it settled something in me that had been braced since I was 20 years old, and learned that the most accurate person in the room is always the least important one in it. The fallout took 2 years. 19 years of Crail's preparation meant 19 years of documents to re-examine, and we found 11 more alterations, none of them grammar, all of them land. Small, quiet, decades old, everyone favouring a house that had paid for it. The record room tripled in size. I hired 9 scribes and taught every one of them the same first lesson, which is that an error of the ear is a man, and an error of the eye is a document, and that the difference between those two things once decided who ruled the North. Roderick retired last spring, and has never once let anyone forget that he saved my life, with a subordinate clause. He tells it at dinners. It gets longer every year. In the current version, he also apprehends Crail single-handed, which, to be fair to him, he did. The court, I should say, has still not recovered. Correcting the crown is now technically permitted in open session by a standing order Hadrian entered himself. And in 3 years exactly, 4 people have ever done it. 3 of them were me. The 4th was a junior scribe of 19 who went white afterward and had to sit down, and to whom I said the only thing worth saying, which was, "Good. Do it again." And on the 9th of last spring, at the opening of court, in front of 400 people, the King of Felgard read the founding oath from a charter amended in my own hand, the first amendment to that text in 200 years, argued through the full council, entered properly, correct in every particular. The king serves the Felgard, and the Felgard endures. He had it right the first time. That is the part I have never quite got over. His father used to say it to him that way at night, when he was small, as a private gloss on a public word. Serves, not rules. And Hadrian had carried it in his mouth for 30 years and let a scribe correct it out of him in public, without one word of protest, because the document said otherwise. And the document is the document. So I fixed the document. It took me 2 years, and it is the only thing I have ever done that I am certain will outlive me. I still wonder what would have happened if I had let it go. I nearly did. Every scribe in that hall would have let it go, and Crail would have had his protectorate by summer, and 11 households downstream would have lost their water in 40 years, and never known why. I do not like where that thought ends, so I do not finish it. But I wonder about you. He knew from the third one. He let me humiliate him 14 more times rather than ask me to stop checking. Was that the finest thing anyone has ever done for me, or the most arrogant? I have argued both sides at 3 in the morning for 3 years. Tell me which one you land on in the comments. Comment the 9th if you want to hear what Hadrian's wolf did the first time I brought the amended charter into that hall. And if you want more nights like this, 1. A king who would rather be thought a fool than break the one honest thing he had. A scribe who could not leave a wrong word alone. And 1 word 200 years out of place. Stay close. There is more of Felgard left to tell. Where are you listening from tonight? I would love to know.